At this point on the agenda, we have Beth Darrow with the Conservancy to give us an update on the annual environmental services contracts that we have between the village and the Conservancy. Beth?
Yeah. So yeah, nice to see you all. I don't think I've met all of you yet, but this contract is, it's a really important partnership between the village and the Conservancy to help ensure the current and future health of the island, especially its habitats and species. And I really enjoyed working with Chris and the village for the past few years on this. So I'm going to give a really brief overview of our various projects. We have a number of them, and I sent you all a pretty extensive report. I'm sorry it's so long, but feel free to contact me at any time if you have questions or want to talk about anything in more detail. I'm going to sort of skim the surface today. So here's just an overview of the various projects that we have going on in this fiscal year. I'm going to touch on the bolded ones here today. And I know that Chris wanted to make sure to leave some time to talk about the deer immunocontraception project in more detail, and a little bit about coyotes in more detail. Next slide, please. I did want to emphasize a newer part of our contract this year, which has been the forest vegetation assessment. We felt that this was a very important addition because so many of the decisions that we make on this island are to protect the maritime forest. The maritime forest is a very rare type of maritime forest. Has a G2 ranking, which means it is globally imperiled. So it's not just, oh, we have forests, it's helpful, we know trees are important. It's also that this particular type of maritime forest is rare and we want to preserve this. And that isn't just for the Bald Headwoods Coastal Reserve, which is a protected state managed entity, but it also goes into, even people's residences and yards and commercial areas that have this lush maritime forest that we're used to and that we enjoy so much on Bald Head Island. There are a number of plots. I don't know if anyone has ventured far enough into the forest to see fences in the forest, but they are there. And the reason that these are there is to look at deer herbivory. So to look at the impacts of deer on the forest. And they've been there since the early 2000s. They're paired fenced and unfenced plots in the forest to look at basically if the deer can't go into the fences, they wouldn't be browsing on those plants, but they're able to access these plants over here. So if there's a difference in those two, then we would assume that it's because of the deer. So in 2011, these were assessed by Taggart and Long, and they didn't find a difference between those two areas. So that is where we got this idea of 200 deer on the island. The island can sustain 200 deer because at that time there were about 200 deer on the island. They weren't seeing an impact. So we don't know what the maximum kind of like deer population size could be. We just know that at that time it looked like there wasn't a major impact. So this year we worked with Jody Forrester from NC State, who went back and assessed these areas again. Now, we don't know if there's an impact of deer currently because those fences haven't really been maintained over the past 10 years. There have been a number of hurricanes, as we know. So the idea is to establish a new baseline, look at the forest structure right now, and then moving forward, maintain those plots so that 5 years from now, we can also continue to keep an eye on the forest and see if there's an impact of herbivory. The one major change, a couple major changes that she did note compared to 2011. One is that the forest canopy seems to have opened up a little bit more. So this is probably due to those hurricanes. It's about 26% canopy openness. So it's going to be interesting to see how the forest kind of regenerates over the next 5 years. Hopefully we don't get hit too much over the next few years. And then the other major change has been the loss of red bay. So the red bay trees have an invasive species that have been attacking them. And it's unfortunately, there's not a cure for that. And the red bays have been dying. This is throughout the southeastern seaboard. And they're slowly being replaced mostly by Carolina laurel cherry, which is another species. So yeah, so that's a major change. We're just recommending to keep maintaining those plots and then in about 5 years do another vegetation assessment. Okay. Continuing in the theme of the forest, JP was mentioning the aquifer wells, so potentially putting in some new wells for production. We do monthly assessments of water level in the forest. So these graphs are from all the different wells that go through that forest area. I just wanted to draw your attention to the swales. So the swales are the kind of ponds in the forest, the low-lying areas in the dunes that sometimes are wet and sometimes are dry. And for the past 3-4 years, those swales have always been wet until this year. So this year was a dry year. The swales were drier. That's normal because it was a drier year. It's also kind of a good thing because we're supposed to do a vegetation assessment of those swale areas to make sure that the amount of water that's being removed from the aquifer isn't impacting vegetation species. So we're recommending that this year, the Bald Head Woods Advisory Group, which includes the Coastal Reserve, recommends that this year that vegetation survey gets done, which hopefully, again, we don't have a hurricane so that those swales remain dry so that we can actually access those areas too.
I'll make a comment here just for some clarity that we've got a number of wells on the island, test wells, monitoring wells, production wells, et cetera, et cetera. So not to confuse, but when the village worked with Limited, the original strip of property that ran through the Maritime Forest Reserve, it ran parallel with Federal Road all the way through. And so the state, I think, between the village and Limited working together, we went to the state and said, well, we don't necessarily want to go through that area. We'd like to work to come up with a new corridor for new potable wells. And this is the area, and it's a strip that runs over here on contractor services back behind here and down the side. And that's where these wells are at. This is where, and as part of that process, the state wanted us to do this monitoring to make sure that we are not having a negative impact on the flora and fauna within this well-filled corridor. And you'll see that in the budget when we put that together, that we have monitoring out of the utilities fund because it's dealing with water for drinking. And then out of the general fund, we budget to fund the Conservancy's part and our consultant, Jim Cornett with Applied Resource Management. So, thank you.
Thanks. Okay, next page, please. All right, so we'll take a minute to talk about deer. So one of our largest projects has been whitetail deer management. This has a few different interconnected components. One part of it I call the deer management project, which is mostly assessing the population size. So we have two different types of surveys that we do. We have a summer spotlight survey and we have a fall camera survey that we do. And those get at slightly different information about the deer herd. But basically those lead into our population size number, which then gives us additional information. Things like, whether we expect to see maybe stresses on the habitats on Bald Head Island. That 200 number is kind of a target that we're looking at. And then also that is used to inform the immunocontraception program. So in the past, if you look back in the early 2000s, here's the population size. And this year we're at 140 deer. But back in the early 2000s, we were over 300 deer. And then there are these sudden drops. So those are because the village at that time was conducting culls to manage the deer population. And then the deer population would spring back again after a cull because the remaining deer are still reproductive. They're pretty prolific. And that continued until 2014 is when we started the immunocontraception program. So basically we applied for a research permit with the village to give deer birth control. And this is not going to be a successful technique in every place, but because we have an island where our deer population is fairly contained, you know, we see the same deer from year to year, and we can give them a booster shot, and we can track them, and we can know whether they're pregnant or not. So this allowed us to gather a lot of information to know that the immunocontraception technique was pretty successful. We're able to keep the deer population below that target number of 200 deer. And it has about an 86% effectiveness rate, as long as the deer have 2 doses of the vaccine. Currently, we are not doing anything with the deer. We're not managing them because we're below that target number. So the current permit expired, and we're trying to discuss what the next steps should be. We go to the next slide. So last year, we did not recommend renewing the permit. We're at a similar low number, but we do recognize that at some point the deer population is likely to need to be managed. And there are a few different ways to go about doing that. One is to try to get back into this research permit using immunocontraception. We would generate a new research question, and we would use kind of a set experimental plan for administering the Gonacon, and then, you know, from year to year, probably using it every year. So one research question might be, how long is Gonacon effective? So the deer right now, the last dose that they had was in 2020. So if we were to start today, apply for a permit, then the earliest time that we could give them more Gonacon would be 2024. So that would be 4 years. You know, is it still effective? Does it wear off? That could be a good research question. Another option for a permit would be an operational permit. And we don't know right now whether the Wildlife Resources Commission, the permitting agency, would support this, because there isn't currently really, I don't know, Gonacon is so new. So this immunocontraception idea isn't used anywhere else in North Carolina. So they don't have in current policy really anything for them to refer to generate an operational permit, is my understanding. It doesn't mean that they wouldn't do it. It just means that it might be more challenging, and there are new staff on the commission that we don't really know what their reaction would be. But that could be used when needed. So this year, the deer population is lower, we don't need it. Okay, we won't use it. Next year, we need it, so we will use it. So it's a little more flexibility, I think. I did want to draw your attention to the cost. So, you know, this is an estimate done from the original permit that, you know, immunocontraception is a lot more expensive than a cull, for example. On the other hand, culls have not been politically supported on the island. So what do we recommend? It's hard to say right now, because we're not in an obvious place where I think, oh, you know, we're over 200 deer. We definitely need something. We need to do it now. We're not there yet. So, you know, one option would be to wait another year and wait and see if the population starts rebounding. But I think what we would recommend doing right now would be to go ahead and apply for a 1-year research permit that would allow us to answer that pregnancy question. So is Gonacon still effective? And then that could inform a future either research permit or operational permit after that. So we would go out, we would capture any deer that have been dosed in the past. We would just look at them for pregnancy rates, and then that would give us some informed conclusions to help us maybe apply for another permit in the future. But I'm happy to talk about different options, answer questions, or have a discussion if you want. Yeah, and then culls is always an option as well. You know, like I don't know, it depends on the feeling on that island. But right now we don't have a very high deer population. We think that coyotes are helping, you know, keep the population on the lower side. Our fawn population has been on the lower side. But at some point, probably the coyotes won't be able to keep up with those fawns. So, you know, something will be needed at some point, in my opinion. I don't know.
The village's decision, whose decision is that to do the contraception versus the cull?
It's the villages, because we essentially fund it. So the question has been historically, should we call or should we do the immunocontraception project?
Right.
Or a combination of both? And it's been the mentality of past councils is doing a combination of both. So we've been funding the immunocontraception program and we've been able to manage the level of the herd to the extent that we haven't had to do a call. But when you talk about the call, as Beth said, the issue of calling for some on the island can be very sensitive and emotional. It's spurred meetings of, some of you recall, standing room only meetings, bench hall meetings that I think put up some pressure to some degree on council probably to invest in the immunocontraception program.
Maybe it's a silly question, but maybe, standing room only could be those that interested, the other ones who show up. I remember 2005, 2008, getting a survey at home asking, what do I prefer? So for people who just have to check a box and not come to a room, to a meeting, do you remember what the answer was on that?
Got a big file with a lot of papers in it, and could probably go back and what the results of the survey were, but I want to say that the results were in favor of coal.
That's what I meant by people who show up versus not mistaking that for speaking for the island.
I've got a question about lag time. So if you're applying for the research, actually having that come in, did you say it would take as much as 2 years?
So actually, Karen, can we go back to, I'll show sort of the cycle of how this is, I didn't go through this, but basically the information that we collect in summer and fall is informing the next year's decision to do something or not, but it's also related to the budgetary process. So like if you were to decide right now that you wanted to fund, say, if we want to start immunocontraception as soon as possible, we wouldn't be able to, there's a permit that we have to apply for, and it's like applying, for a research grant or something, where I doubt, I mean, I could be wrong, but I doubt that that would be ready to go by the following spring. I think that it would probably take, and then, so the permit's then approved, and then you all decide to allocate the budget in the following year's budget to then go through with the immuno for that next spring. So that's where like the 2-year process comes in.
So in the future, if we're having a discussion about the immuno program, it would be great to have the data that, yes, this is working and this is how long it lasts for, because then we could actually be targeting, so this is probably an allotment that if we want to chase that path, we got to plan for it every 4 years, 6 years, X. So that type of research actually makes a lot of sense to me, to be going after it right away. Is it to you or is that just me?
No, I would agree, and that's the reason that we fund the annual deer population surveys.
Right.
Is to maintain that data set that we can then go to have the discussions with WRC to get what it is, what do we need to do to get the permit. As Beth said, there's been change in the WRC and the commission and at the staff level, that folks that aren't there today that were there when we worked with them 4, 5, 6 years ago to get that initial pilot project permit for 5 years. And then we added an additional year extension. And so, and we had a call with them 3 weeks or so ago, and we sort of talked about all of this and trying to figure out what is the process. Is that?
Yeah, because my understanding in the past was that operational permit was off the table, that if we wanted to do this, it would need to be a research permit because there was no mechanism policy mechanism for an operational permit. But this most recent conversation made it seem like it might be an option, but they didn't really know how the new commission would, what they would think about it. So I think they're basically saying you kind of have to try to know. And they didn't give us a strong feeling like, yeah, you better maintain, go for it right now. You need to strongly control those deer, or everyone seems a little bit in a
waffle.
unsure place right now.
So my thought with all this is that we just proceed in trying to get the permit, whether it's the research or the operational, so that we have it in hand. As far as the budget, I mean, you guys could approve a budget with funds in it in next year's budget if the permit came in, we needed to implement it, but it's doubtful it will based on the surveys and projections, but
Yeah, I'm not sure we would need it next year, but maybe the year after.
yeah, but we go ahead and work to obtain the permit, which, you know, and I think I talked with you, Mayor, about as far as a policy decision of council, you know, is that something you all, is contraception still something you think is viable for the village to do? Or do you feel, well, we just call if the number starts to get a little above and not do contraception?
But that's not a decision for now. You're saying that's a decision for a year from now or 2 years from now. Right. Yeah, but I'm still admit $2,000 doesn't look like much money. When we talk about 100 things, $200,000, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay, it's 2,000 times however many deer.
Yeah.
I mean, it would end up being, what was it, Chris?
say 75,000 to say in-house 15,000.
Right.
On any given.
right. This is one of these things, so that, I try, in my head, I'm comparing it to Eric. So we have such a robust monitoring of our beaches so that we know exactly, we can project out way in advance. And the idea that we have this issue, it'd be great to have ongoing data. And so,
Yeah, I just say that, we didn't have pregnancy data until a few years ago. And that's one thing that we changed about it was like this, we're gonna do it and see what happens with the deer number. Well, that's not a direct way of knowing whether it works, right? So that's why we started getting blood samples, do direct determinations of pregnancy rates on single dose and double dose. And then that was way more valuable than just knowing how many deer were out there, right? There's a lot of factors in deer. So once we started doing that, but the one piece we don't have, as Beth mentioned, is how long does it last? Right. And that is an unknown, Again, it's not our decision whether y'all want to do it or not, but I do want to make sure that it's based on as much information as we can provide, and I think it would be useful for later.
So I think what I'm hearing is an agreement that we proceed with WRC to obtain a permit, whether it's a research or operational, in advance of the potential to do something the year after next.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that's what I'm hearing too, Chris. I question, however, whether the WRC is going to give us the operating permit, given the numbers are pretty stable right now, but doesn't hurt to ask.
With the research permit, you would have a chance at, right?
It sounded like they supported that idea if the village is willing to fund
Data and then-
effort.
Right.
I mean, the thing to keep in mind is that that would be a year of, basically full cost, because the captures are the main cost without administering GonaCon, so we're not, I mean, we could. So that would be a question too. I think we would need to maybe work out some of the details of, do we want to just capture them just to get their blood samples to get that data? Or, I mean, we could go ahead and give them a dose, but if the question is to help inform a future operational permit, it's just a difference in the purpose.
Yeah. Okay.
So giving them the dose of GonaCon is the easy part once we have our hands on them. So, okay. All right, I think we can move along. I just wanted to touch on a couple other of our projects. So to touch on our creek water quality project, this is one of those long-term data collection things I think could be very, very, very valuable in the future. I think it is valuable now. It's helped inform things like if we see high bacterial levels, we can chat with Chris and say, is something happening on the island that, you know, we need to keep an eye on. But you know, we want to keep an eye on this creek marsh system because a healthy marsh is protecting basically the island's backside. The creek is used for a lot of resident and visitor activities, including fishing and shellfishing. And, you know, people spend a lot of time in that water, so it's a public health concern as well. So we conduct weekly sampling for a number of different factors. We also do quarterly sampling at 2 sites, which is a 24-hour process. And, you know, basically we're just kind of keep an eye on things. We now have enough data, multiple years of data, where we can start to detect long-term changes, which is really interesting. And then this is also led this year into a new grant through the U.S. Coastal Research Program. They are going to fund a water quality sonde that's going to be out by the mouth of the creek that's going to be collecting data all the time. So what's nice is we can say to the grant agency that we can leverage these ongoing data collection efforts for a more intensive data collection effort that will help inform us more in the future. Next slide, please. So here's just an example, and I provide a lot more graphs in the report, but on the left is fecal coliform data. These are our 4 sites that we collect data from. So we have the mouth, Mid Creek, upstream, and there's a site in Cape Creek. And this is on a logarithmic scale. So if you just look at the last, you know, chunk here, you can see that the fecal coliform levels in the past year have been really low. In fact, most of the time they've been below detection, but definitely below that 100 CFU number, which is that dotted line, which is like a regulatory level that we want for safe shellfishing waters. So that's been really good recently.
So the spike in 2018 probably was related to Florence and all the
I believe so. Yeah.
downstream
Florence,
runoff.
did you say? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, if you go back and look, most of these spikes are hurricane related. There was one after Isaias in 2020, that was one that we talked about and couldn't find a major reason for it, but it dissipated, so it was pretty good. I'll just draw your attention also to nitrate. So nitrogen, we have a seasonal cycle that it tends to get higher in the wintertime. That's just kind of a natural kind of oceanographic type phenomenon. But definitely this in 2021, you can see these humps. It was the highest that we've collected data for in record nitrate concentrations. But it looks like that nitrate is coming from the mouth of the creek. So it's Cape Fear River coming in. I don't know if it's from upstream or where it's coming from, but not something that we can really control locally, but good to know that we have that nitrate coming in, which then could feed into other water quality issues, potentially algae blooms, things like that. So we're just recommending continuing with this. Move along. I'm going to go back again to aquifer because, as Chris said, a number of the wells are in the woods, but that's sort of a different project than the rest of the wells on the island. So this is looking at the wells throughout the entire island, and we're looking for things like salinity intrusion into our aquifer. So we do depth to water measurements monthly. We have over 10 years of data. In 2021, we did have slightly lower groundwater levels because it was a slightly drier year, but nothing of concern. We do water quality measurements as well. And here's just one example of one well that is slightly concerning because it does have high nitrate concentrations, and this well is on the golf course. So something to keep an eye on that, you know, as fertilizers / wastewater, there could be some infiltration into the aquifer at that location. There are wells on the periphery of the island that have higher salinity. So we do know that, you know, our groundwater table is relatively shallow in those spots. And what we would be looking for that would cause alarm would be if that starts encroaching into the island, but we haven't seen that yet. So I think we should continue doing that as well. Okay, next. This data has also led to a collaboration with Dr. Peter Zamora from UNCW, who's been doing some modeling for the village. So he's created a 3D model and he has some results that I wanted to share with you. It's kind of hard to see in this format, but there is an animation that's really cool. So if you get a chance to click the link in your PDF, it's pretty neat to see what he did here. So he's created this 3D model, which simulates the groundwater, and you can test different scenarios. So you can say, he's already done if we removed more drinking water, or what if there was sea level rise, or what if there was channel deepening. But this year he did the response to a precipitation event. He simulated Hurricane Florence, and he has here's the island, and the depth is in red or warmer colors of flooding during Hurricane Florence. And then these graphs in the bottom, you can see the blue one is the rain over 3 full days of rain on the island. And if you just want to scroll through, Karen, these are just different time steps in the model. So after 1 day, you can see that we're starting to get some surface level flooding. And I don't know if anyone was here 1 day to Florence, hopefully not. But definitely the golf course lagoons, the marsh was flooding after a day of rain. We move on to the next one. And then this is after 4 days of rain. We have pretty much all of this, most of the surfaces of the island are seeing some surface level flooding. And definitely on the golf course, we have really deep flooding. These are the lagoons and other areas, very low-lying areas of the golf course, the swales behind the marshes, Federal Road is underwater. And, that made sense to him at that time, but where he got very confused was if you move to the next. This is after 3 weeks, and you can see that the island is still very flooded. And I think that Chris would confirm that it was still pretty flooded after 3 weeks. But where Peter was confused about this was because our sediment here is so coarse grained that he really expected it to drain faster than it did. He was very surprised at this. But maybe the numbers are a little off, but I feel like this is what I remember from coming back onto the island after 3 weeks, that the golf course was still flooded, Federal Road was still pretty flooded. All those low-lying areas in the forest were flooded. And what he's learned is that the way the groundwater flows on this island is different than some other places, where groundwater actually flows into the golf course from other places. It flows into the golf course and into those swales before it then goes down into the groundwater. So, and then out to sea or out to the creek. So it's a 2-step process for this island to drain. And that is what causes it to take longer than some other places.
Yeah, I mean, that's why we do the flood pumping with the emergency outfalls, is to pump all that water off out in the river and the ocean until that surface water gets back within the banks of the lagoon system. So, but 3 weeks is a little bit long. I mean, from the time we got on the island and started pumping, we made a really good dent in it within the first 7 days. I'd say by 14 days, that there was probably still some of that in the low areas of the forest and some isolated spots, but
Yeah.
I think by 28
I think
days.
this includes what you guys did. I think this is just a natural scenario.
Yeah.
This is not with the active.
Gotcha, okay. Okay.
Right.
So this is a
Well, that
simulation,
make-
that act.
That makes.
Right, this is a simulation.
That makes more sense.
But that's an important observation that, then you can use to calibrate, kind of tweak and say like, okay, so, so I guess what Peter is saying is that this could be used, if we needed to tweak a little bit and say, hey, how high did the water get on hole X or whatever, then that could be used for future scenario testing. So something like, how big of a storm do you need to flood Federal Road? Or, how long would it be expected to take for that flooding to go down after a storm of this many inches? So I think it's a pretty cool tool. We're not proposing to add I mean, he's put a lot of work already into this structure. I think there are a few things that we could do to help ask some of those questions if there are things that y'all think are relevant, but we're not proposing to add anything new to next year's contract.
I don't know if it's relevant and worth spending money on, but if we were doing it ourselves, you have pumping stations in place. So you'd want to build those into the model so you would see these projections based on reality, what would happen based on what we have in place.
Right.
I'm not saying we would do that, but
Right.
that would.
That, yeah, that would be easy to give Peter that data, and you sent me an email on that and to incorporate that.
Yeah. All right, I think I gotta speed along here. Just to draw your attention, we do have a beach Vitex program in place. We're battling this plant. If you have this plant on your property, please treat it very poorly. We don't like it. So we've been using drones to track its presence so that we don't have to tromp through the dunes all the time. Next slide, please. Here's an example of the areas that the drone can identify. And we finally have a total plant area number for this year. So we have about 1,500 square meters of Vitex on the island this year. We'll be able to look at that from year to year. Most of it is along South Beach, especially like Killigray Ridge, Scotch Bonnet, Pepper Vine. Those areas have the highest concentrations.
What I noticed about that is those areas are in a part of the shoreline that didn't exist probably 15 some years ago. That's all relatively new, which tells me that this Vitex continues to repropagate.
Yeah.
Which is not, I mean, it's not because they have so many seeds, so easy for it. So it's not surprising that we're still dealing with this all these years later, and we'll continue to need to manage it.
Right, so we did do an experiment this year. And we're almost done with it because I was concerned about that too. Why is it regenerating? Is our herbicide even effective? Are there different herbicide methods we can use or different times of year that we could apply the herbicide? And so far we're seeing that herbicide is effective. You can see this is like the percent control of the plants. The hack and the remove methods are two different herbicide applications. Plants are still gone. We're going to keep looking back at those specific plants from year after year to see, but I just think that they require a constant vigilance almost. And we did have a couple years there with Hurricane Florence and then I guess Dorian, where our window to treat was cut short. So we weren't able to get to every plant on the island those 2 years, but we have the past 2020 and 2021. So but I am confident now that our herbicide is working. We're out there working, and I can say that it is effective, which is a nice feeling. So let's move on to predators, and this is another topic of interest. So we do a few different predator surveys. We do an alligator survey every summer. So if you have property on the golf course, please don't yell at us when we're out there at night, or you can yell at us, but don't shoot us or anything. So we do spotlight surveys. We count alligators of all different sizes. This guy was at the villas, so but minding his own business, he's fine. This year we are collaborating with Dr. Scott Belcher from NC State to apply satellite tags to some of the larger gators. We're going to wait till they all wake up in the spring, and we'll be able to know where they go, what their presence is, what their home ranges are like. These are a lot of the questions that the public have about, you know, I feel like they're increasing. Why am I seeing them everywhere? But I think we can also then inform the village public safety about where to keep an eye out for these gators. This is not going to be publicly available information. It's just, you know, for us to have an idea of where they go and what they're doing. Next slide, please. But to answer that question about, I feel like the numbers of alligators are increasing through time. That's not the case, at least not for the larger alligators. We did see more small 0 to 3 foot alligators last year. There was one lagoon that had a ton of babies, but the large guys, 11 foot plus guys, we're really only seeing like maybe 1 or 2 a night. So we don't have any evidence that we're getting a lot more large gators through time. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and then to focus on coyotes. So we have just really been formally surveying coyotes for the past 4 years or so. We look for coyotes during our deer spotlight surveys. We collect that data too. So it's always a known route, known number of nights, standardized from year to year. You can see that our sightings per night have increased through time. And in 2021 is the first time that we've had a significant, I can say that there's a significant increase in sightings compared to 2018. This was a real concern in 2019 because coyotes were getting into sea turtle nests and consuming those little baby hatchlings and eggs. But we have made changes to the cage material that we use on the sea turtle nest that seem to have really helped with that. So last year we only had 4 nests that were taken by coyotes. 2 of them had cages on them. 2 of them we hadn't gotten the cage on yet. So that has decreased a lot, which has been a real positive. But we still don't know how many coyotes are on the island. We don't know their home range, their habits, how related they are to each other, where they come from, where they go, which are a lot of the questions that we get at the Conservancy from the concerned public. So we are proposing a SCAT study. We have a potential collaborator from NC State and the Museum of Natural Sciences who has a lot of experience with this kind of work, where we can collect the SCAT that I'm sure you've seen everywhere. It's really easy to find, and then do a molecular genetics study to look at the number of individuals on the island. If you go to the next slide, please. The nice thing about this is that it's not invasive. We don't have to capture coyotes to get information on them. They freely donate the samples. So we would do transects for about 2 weeks, and then we would also take some samples from Southport, Fort Fisher, Oak Island that some of our collaborators can grab for us. And then we can send them to Dr. Kierpka, and she would just charge for supplies basically, because she has a number of students and she would use it as part of a course that she's teaching. So our results would be the number of unique individuals, the sex, how related they are to each other, like how many family groups we have, and then also any movement patterns or territories based on where we got the samples from. And this has been shown, this is a map of New York City where they did a similar study and they could track where the coyotes' different ranges were based on where they got their samples. So that is a new thing that we're proposing for this year. I think it has a lot of potential to give us interesting information. The Wildlife Resources Commission is also interested in this, and they've said that, you know, preliminary data might then be able to lead into a larger statewide study. So there's potential for it to be kind of seed for a larger project in the future. Any questions about predator stuff? And then finally, I just wanted to emphasize our shorebird work that we've been doing. This started as part of the terminal groin permit that we started formally counting and surveying shorebirds, but we've continued this with the village's support for the past few years. So we set up protection areas of their nesting areas at Access 1 and near the terminal groin is where we've traditionally had nesting shorebirds, including Wilson's plovers and least terns. We used to have really large least tern colonies, but we haven't had any since about, I think 2017. I know I haven't seen them since I've started working here. But we did have a least tern nest this year near the terminal groin, which is pretty exciting. So if you didn't know, these shorebirds lay their eggs directly on the sand. So they're really hard to see. So this is why we put up these postings, because we want to keep people and dogs from accidentally walking through and accidentally stepping on their nests. So this year we did have a successful Wilson's plover nest, which is pretty exciting. They're like little cotton balls on toothpicks. They're very cute. And then we also had red knots foraging this fall on near Access 1, and that's a important migratory species of concern, protected species. So we think it's important to continue these symbolic postings and surveys and education. We're an Audubon important bird area, and it brings in a lot of tourists and residents who really enjoy birding. So I think it's worth supporting. Okay, that is pretty much all I have. So basically the projects I think would mostly stay the same. I had a question mark by immunocontraception. We would take the modeling off this year. And I think that it's a nice variety of shorter term and longer term projects that are pretty impactful and give us a lot of good information about the health of the island. So thank you for your support. Any questions?